G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Book of Hebrews. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So today we're going to look at Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11 to 28. We're going to get straight into it, and we're going to get straight into chapter 9, verse 11, where we're looking at Jesus as a better sacrifice. And this is the fifth of the contrasts that we see. The contrast that we see to show the superiority of the new priesthood, which is the one according to the Melchizedekian order, to the Levitical priesthood. And what we're going to see here is that this new priesthood is based on better sacrifices, or a better sacrifice. Now, the old priesthood, the old Levitical priesthood, was based on animal blood, which only provided a temporary atonement, while the new priesthood is based on Messiah's blood, which provides for an eternal redemption. So in verses 11 to 12, we see that Christ, having come a high priest of the good things to come, through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this creation, nor yet through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood, entered in once for all into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption. So what we see here is that the author is showing us the superiority of the Messiah's sacrifice, and he shows it to us in three ways. We have a better sanctuary, we have a better offering, the nature of his offering is better, and this one, it abides forever, it's eternal. Now, the first one we're going to look at is the better sanctuary, and this is verse 11. In verse 11, we see the first superiority of his priestly work, and it is the place where he functions. Jesus now functions in a better sanctuary. And he proves this by contrasting the earthly sanctuary that the Levitical priests entered with the divine or heavenly sanctuary that Jesus entered. The heavenly tabernacle is both greater and more perfect than the old earthly tabernacle. Remember that the old earthly tabernacle was made by sinful human hands. The heavenly one was not made with hands at all. The earthly one was of this creation and was earthy, but the heavenly one is not of this creation because it is heavenly. Now, the author draws a contrast here between the work of the high priest on the Day of Atonement, which is Yom Kippur, and the work of the Messiah. Now, the contrast here is not between Jesus and the Levitical offerings of Leviticus chapters 1 to 7. It's not between Jesus and the actual offerings themselves. It's between the most important day of the Levitical year and what the Messiah accomplished through his death. And that became the basis for the ministry of the great high priest in heaven. And this is the Day of Atonement, which we find in Leviticus chapter 16. Now, the means here is the contrast between the earthly sanctuary and the heavenly sanctuary into which Jesus entered. It is both greater and it is more perfect than the old sanctuary. It's not made with hands, so it's not human, and it's not of this creation. It's not earthly, but it is heavenly. To summarize what the author said, what he's virtually saying is that the Messiah came as a high priest of the good things to come. The good things to come were the Messianic fulfillments. He came through the heavenly tabernacle, which is more perfect because it can bring the believer to spiritual maturity. Now we see the second superiority of Messiah's priestly work is the nature of his offering. And this is found in the first part of verse 12. Nor yet through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood entered in once for all into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption. Again, the focus here is specifically on the Day of Atonement, and it's the Day of Atonement sacrifice, which we see in Leviticus 16. The earthly sacrifice was the blood of goats and calves or bulls. Blood of goats was for the people. You find it in Leviticus 16, verse 15. And the blood of the calves or the bulls was for the priests. And you see that in Leviticus 16:11. Jesus did not come into the heavenly tabernacle carrying the blood of a goat or a bull, but he entered through his own blood. And that blood is a memorial of his sacrifice. His blood is a remembrance. Now, chapter 12, when we get there, will show that his blood is still in the heavenly tabernacle and will continue to exist in the New Jerusalem for all eternity. Now, another contrast we find here is that the priests, they entered into the earthly tabernacle with blood, but Jesus entered the heavenly tabernacle through blood. The priest had to come carrying blood for his own sins, and the blood he carried was not his own blood. It was animal blood. Jesus had no sins, and therefore he went through blood, and this blood was his own. So what we also see is that an additional contrast concerns the frequency of visits. The priest had to go into the Holy of Holies yearly, but this one, Jesus, entered once for all. So this one entrance of Jesus left the way forever open for every believer. And just like your banknotes, there's no intrinsic value since their value is based on the gold that is backing them. By the same token, animal blood itself has no intrinsic value because its value is based on Messiah's blood that is backing it. Now, the third superiority of what we see here is his priestly work. And this is the second part of verse 12. It has an abiding efficacy. It continues. It's forever. By entering through his own blood, Jesus now obtained eternal redemption. So in place of a yearly temporary atonement, we now have an eternal redemption. And this again shows that, the certainty of eternal security. So in these two verses, which is 11 and 12, there are three features concerning the Messiah's entrance into the heavenly tabernacle. First up, it was through his own blood. Second, it was once and for all. And third, it resulted in his obtaining eternal redemption for all who believe in him, that is. Now, in verses 13 to 28, we see the results of Messiah's sacrifice. And there are three results of his sacrifice. We're going to see in verses 13 to 14 the result. One of the results is purification. Then in 15 to 22, we're going to see it's the ratification of a new covenant. And then in 23 to 28, it's the ministry in the new tabernacle. So first up, in verses 13 to 14, we see purification. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling them that have been defiled, sanctify unto the cleanness of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish unto God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. So here we see that the first result of his sacrifice was purification. And the Old Testament background to this is in Leviticus 16 and Numbers 19. Leviticus 16 and Numbers 19. Verse 13 makes a logical connection here. It says for. So in light of what we've just said in verses 11 to 12, he's about now to show why the redemption is eternal. Old Testament sacrifices were limited to outward cleansing. They only cleansed the flesh. But the work of Jesus now benefits in the spiritual area, in the spiritual sphere, and it results in inward spiritual cleansing. Animal blood only cleansed ceremonial uncleanness. The blood of bulls cleansed the ceremonial uncleanness of the priest. The blood of goats cleanse the ceremonial uncleanness of the people. The ashes of the red heifer were used for the cleansing of corpse uncleanness, meaning if you touched a corpse, you were unclean in that respect. So you had to be cleansed by the ashes of the red heifer and some other elements along with that. We find it in Numbers chapter 19, verses 1 to 22. The sprinkling of the water was for the unclean, which was the waters of separation, which we find in Numbers 19, verse 9. So the result of the blood of bulls and goats, the ashes of the red heifer, and the sprinkling of the waters of separation was only purification of the flesh. These sacrifices only cleansed outward ceremonial uncleanness. If animal blood through an earthly ritual can cleanse the flesh, in verse 14, how much more shall the blood of Christ, through the eternal Spirit, offered himself without blemish unto God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. So verse 14 states that this is not true of the blood of Jesus. The author presents his own logical conclusion in the form of a contrast by using a rabbinic form of logic called calvacoma. Calvacoma, it's an argument which goes from the lesser to the greater. What he's saying is if animal blood could do this much, well, then how much more could the Messiah's blood do? If animal blood through an earthly ritual can cleanse the flesh, well, how much more can the blood of Jesus cleanse? Jesus's cleansing reaches all the way up to heaven. His cleansing is spiritual. His cleansing is not only the outward of the flesh, which is the external, it also cleanses the conscience, which he says here. It cleanses the conscience. So the blood of Jesus does exactly what the blood of the Mosaic law could not do. It cleanses the conscience. Remember, year after year, they'd go back on Day of Atonement and offer these sacrifices for their sins. Year after year, their conscience was never ever cleansed. So this now emphasizes the blood as the source of purification. However, in the case of Jesus, it was better blood. Animal blood, remember, was under the curse, but Messiah's blood was not tainted by sin. That's why his blood is a better sacrifice. The offering of Jesus's blood was different than the offering of animal blood. And we can see this in four ways. First of all, in the case of Jesus, his was a voluntary offering. It was not forced upon him as it was with the animals. The animals, if they had a choice, they wouldn't go and offer themselves to be slain. The offering of Jesus was also rational. It was not made without reason, as in the case of the animals. The third thing we see here is that it was spontaneous and it was in obedience to a command, whereas animals did not die voluntarily, they were commanded to die. And the fourth thing we see is that it was a moral choice. It was not a mechanical performance of some ritual. It was not at all. It was a moral choice. And we see that in these four ways, Jesus offered his blood through the eternal Spirit. In some translations, the word spirit is capitalized to imply that it is the Holy Spirit, but more likely it's speaking of Jesus's own human spirit here. It's through his human spirit. He willingly laid down his life. His death not only removed defilement, but it also removed the source of defilement, and therefore the conscience is now cleansed. So the author's argument in verses 13 to 14, we can sum it up this way. First of all, in 5 points here. First of all, the means of cleansing was the blood of Jesus. The basis of cleansing was the voluntary death of Jesus. The third thing we see here is that it was without spot or blemish, since there was no moral failure on his part. And Peter makes the same point in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 19. Yeah, the fourth thing we see is that the object here was to purge the conscience from dead works. And these dead works were the works of the Levitical system, works which are now dead because they have come to an end as far as God is concerned. The Mosaic law has come to an end. And the fifth thing is that the goal of Jesus's death was for the believers to serve the living God. They're not to return to the dead works of the Levitical system, but to serve the living God. And remember, this whole purpose of this epistle to the Hebrew believers is that they want to return into that dead system to try and escape persecution. Now we see the second thing we see here is that it is the ratification of a new covenant, and we see these in verses 15 to 22. In verse 15 it says, "And for this cause he is the mediator of a new covenant, that a death having taken place for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first covenant, they that have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance." So the second result of Messiah's sacrifice is the ratification of a new covenant. And back in chapter 8, the author stated that the new priesthood is based upon a better covenant. Now he's going to show how that covenant was signed. And in verse 15, he begins with the reception of an eternal inheritance. And for this cause, that is, for the reason he stated in verse 14, the cleansing of the conscience, because the death of Jesus cleansed the conscience, certain things are now true. First, he's the mediator of a new covenant. And now a mediator, what's he do? A mediator is someone who intervenes between two people, either to make peace or to make friendship. And secondly, it's also a mediator can ratify a covenant. In this case, it's ratifying the new covenant in contrast with the old covenant, which was the Mosaic covenant. Now, while the Mosaic covenant was able to point out transgressions, it could never bring in the inheritance of the promised blessing. That's why a new covenant was needed, and Jesus is the mediator of this new covenant. The second thing we see here is that the death of Jesus made atonement for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first covenant. Now, the truth is that the Old Testament sacrifices did not remove the sins of the Old Testament saints. If you see the word Kippur, like Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, the word Kippur for atonement simply means to cover. So animal blood could not remove the sins of the Old Testament saints. It only covered them. It only covered them. And we going on in verse 14, it says, "They that have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance." Now, what we see here is that when an Old Testament saint died, he could not go directly to heaven. He instead went down to what they call paradise, or Abraham's bosom. That was a section of Sheol or Hades. And what they did was they waited for the death of the mediator. They waited for the death of Jesus, which is a time when the saints' sins were then removed. So when Jesus died, he did not simply die for all the sins to be committed after his death. It wasn't just those that were after the year 30. He also died for the sins which were committed before his death, for sins committed under the first covenant. And the same point we see in Romans chapter 3, verse 25. Now, the phrase that we see here, "they that have been called," it shows us that the Old Testament saints' sins were removed at a point in time after his salvation. So after the Old Testament saint was saved, sometime later his sins were removed. So when he first believed, when the Old Testament saint first believed, he was called or saved at that moment. However, his sins were merely covered over. They were not removed. His sins would be removed the same way New Testament saints' sins are removed and that's by the death of Jesus Christ. An Old Testament saint was called to salvation at a specific point in his life, and at that time he became a believer. Only later did he receive the promise of eternal inheritance. He received the fulfillment of the promise only upon the death of Jesus. So the death of Jesus provided atonement in the sense of taking away the sins for both the Old Testament saints and the New Testament saints. The death of Jesus removed the sins of the first covenant, the Mosaic covenant, and provided the ratification needed for the new covenant. And a new covenant we're talking about is the one that Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah 31 to 34 speaks about. And this is a covenant that brings blessings in the place of condemnation. The basis of the new covenant is the death of Jesus. So we have a death having taken place. Now, these Old Testament saints do have their eternal inheritance because their sins have been removed. They are now in heaven and having ascended into heaven with Jesus, which you can see in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 8 to 10. Ephesians 4, 8 to 10, where it says Jesus led captivity on high. In verse 16 to 17, we see the principle at work here. For where a testament is, there must of necessity be the death of him that made it. For a testament is of force where there has been death, for it does never avail while he that made it liveth. So now in verse 16, what the author does here, he switches now thinking from a covenant to a will which you and I make. And the connection between the two is the concept of inheritance. A will provides for an inheritance. And he points out here that a will cannot be executed until the death of the one who made the will, until the death of the testator, until the one who wrote the will dies. Until the testator dies, the contents of the will with its benefits and provisions are only promises. In human relations, a will or a testament is only in force after the death of the one who made the will. And in the same way, in God's bequeathing salvation to the lost sinner, the bequest is only operative after the sinner dies. After he dies, he enters heaven. They're saved now, but they enter heaven only upon death, except that if you're raptured, that is. If we're raptured before we die, well, we still get to heaven anyway. Now, after speaking of the Messiah as the mediator of this new covenant, who made that covenant effective with his death, the author is now pointing out another benefit to his death, and that is believers are destined to inherit something. That something that has been willed is a heavenly home. His main point here is that a testament or a will demands death. And this helps to explain why in verse 15, he speaks of the Messiah as the mediator of the new covenant, who then made that covenant effective through his death. And in that way, or in the way, lost sinners who accept salvation on the terms of the will or testament now can come into their inheritance. Wherefore, even the first covenant had not been dedicated without blood. And so we see the principle in verses 18 to 22 now illustrated. He now reverts back from the concept of a will, and he now goes back to the concept of a covenant. And the Old Testament background for these verses is Exodus 24, verses 3 to 8. 24 verses 3 to 8. Exodus. In verse 18, the first covenant was ratified by blood. Here too, a death had taken place, but it was the death of an animal. Mosaic covenant was ratified by the shedding of blood, but the blood was animal blood. And even though it was only animal blood, it was a pledge that the terms of the covenant would be fulfilled. The shedding of the blood, of the animal blood, marked the immutability of the covenant terms that were laid down. Even though the old covenant was a blood covenant, it could be done away with. It could be done away with. From the beginning, it was only a conditional covenant. The Mosaic covenant was a conditional covenant, but it was binding until it was done away with. The shedding and the offering of blood proved that a covenant was ratified. In a blood covenant such as the Mosaic covenant, the terms of the covenant could be changed up until the point that blood was shed. Now, once the covenant was ratified by the shedding of blood, the contents of the covenant were unchangeable, even though it was only carried out through animal blood. You could not change the contents after the blood was shed. Now, Jesus ratified a blood covenant with his own blood. He did not ratify it with the blood of animals. He offered better blood. While it was not necessary for the one making the covenant to die, but simply to shed blood, Jesus went further and he offered his own blood, which was now better blood. Now, as in the case of the Mosaic ratification, where the death of the animal gave validity to the covenant and made the content unchangeable, the same thing is true of this ratification. In the Mosaic covenant, the blood proceeded from the covenanting one, but it was animal blood. Here, with this new covenant, Jesus offered his own blood, better blood. Verse 19, for when every commandment had been spoken by Moses unto all the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and he sprinkled both the book itself and all the people. So Moses used a solemn blood ceremony to seal the covenant after he spoke the words of the law, meaning after he spoke the commandments that God gave, and we find this in Exodus chapters 20 to 24. Then in Exodus 24 verses 1 to 8, he then ratified the covenant by sprinkling blood, both the book of the covenant and the people with blood. He sprinkled both of them. He used the blood of the calves and the goats, and he used water and scarlet and wool and hyssop. The sprinkling of blood on both the book and the people meant two things. First, the people were to obey what was in the book. And second, if they obeyed God's commands, God would bless them. And in verse 20, saying, this is the blood of the covenant which God commanded to you, toward you. So in verse 20, the action of sprinkling with the blood pledged the life of the people if they failed to obey. This is the blood of the covenant which God commanded to you. That was to Israel. The blood ratified the covenant that God made with the people. And then in verse 21, Moses sprinkled everything in the tabernacle with blood. Everything in the tabernacle had come into contact with man since it was all man-made, and therefore it needed to be cleansed with blood. In Exodus, there is no statement that says Moses sprinkled the tabernacle with blood, but actually it's mentioned in Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, and both Josephus and what we see here in the New Testament confirm that Moses did sprinkle the tabernacle and the vessels with blood. Verse 22, and according to the law, I may almost say, all things are cleansed with blood, and apart from shedding of blood, there is no remission. So in verse 22, the author gives his conclusion. Under the law, almost everything was cleansed with blood. The reason he states almost is because some things were cleansed by water and some things were not cleansed at all. The principle is this. The principle is, and according to the law, as far as remission of sin is concerned, blood had to be shed, for apart from the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. His point is that the forgiveness of sin demands blood. Now, we see here now the ministry in the new tabernacle in verses 23 to 28. It was necessary, therefore, that the copies of the things in the heavens should be cleansed with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. So what we see here is that the third result of Messiah's sacrifice is his ministry in the new tabernacle. Previously, the author focused on the use of blood for cleansing and remission of sin. Now, the use of blood in preparation for the way of approach is going to be enlarged. And the author shows that Jesus cleansed the heavenly sanctuary through his own blood, unlike Moses, who cleansed the earthly one with the blood of bulls and goats. In verse 23, the cleansing of the heavenly typifies the cleansing of the earthly. It was necessary for the copies to be purged with animal blood. The copies are the things in the earthly tabernacle. The copies of the earthly tabernacle and all of its articles and furnishings, which he mentioned earlier, it was necessary to use animal blood to sanctify, to cleanse the earthly tabernacle. They were only copies, and therefore animal blood was sufficient to sanctify the copies. But the heavenly things themselves need to have better sacrifices than these. Now, the one in heaven is the original. It's the ideal tabernacle, and it was necessary to cleanse the heavenly tabernacle with better blood. And the expression, it was necessary, that's simply emphasizing the absolute necessity of what he's describing in this verse. It was absolutely necessary that the heavenly things needed better sacrifices than these earthly ones, meaning better than animal sacrifices. It could only be cleansed with the blood of Jesus. Now, although the sacrifice that Jesus made was a one-time sacrifice, we see there it says better sacrifices. It's plural. Better sacrifices than these. What it is, it's a generic or an intensive plural that shows that all the Old Testament sacrifices of all kinds were fulfilled in the one sacrifice of Jesus. His sacrifice had to be better because the heavenly tabernacle required better cleansing in keeping with its better nature. Now, this raises an obvious question here. Why did the heavenly tabernacle need to be cleansed in the first place? First up, when Satan rebelled against God, where was he? He was still in heaven. And so Satan's rebellion brought sin into heaven itself. And if we just quickly look at Isaiah 14, verses 12 to 14, Isaiah 14, 12 to 14. Isaiah writes, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, that didst lay low the nations? And thou saidst in thy heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit upon the mount of congregation, in the uttermost parts of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will make myself like the Most High." That was Satan's declaration. And another passage, Ezekiel 28, 11 to 19, states that he defiled the sanctuary in heaven. And so for this reason, the heavens were not clean. And we see Job himself saying that in Job 4:18 and Job 15:15 and 25:5. The second reason here we see is that man is united with his creation. When man sinned, his sin reached even onto heaven. That's why Colossians chapter 1, verse 20, it says, "And through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross, through him, I say, whether things upon the earth or things in the heavens." So Colossians 1:20 teaches us that when Jesus died, he reconciled things in heaven as well as on earth. For these reasons, the heavenly tabernacle needed the cleansing of better blood. For Christ entered not into a holy place made with hands, like in pattern to the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear before the face of God for us. That's verse 24. So in these verses, 24 to 26, the author now deals with Messiah's entrance once and for all into God's presence for us, and he points out three key results. The first key truth we find in verse 24 is that Messiah entered into heaven. He's drawing a contrast here between the Holy of Holies on earth as opposed to the presence of God, which it represented. This Jesus, went into the presence of God in heaven and not into the Holy of Holies on earth. He went into heaven itself, now to appear openly before the face of God for us. And this is in contrast to the earthly priest. On Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, and remember, on Yom Kippur, that is the only day that the high priest actually enters into the Holy of Holies. The earthly high priest, on that Day of Atonement, the earthly high priest would enter into the Holy of Holies, and he would enter in alone. And in actual fact, his work in there was a secret ministry because no one else could see it. And also, before he did so, what happened was he had to put the incense onto the altar, and the smoke from the altar of incense preceded him into the Holy of Holies, so that his face was actually hidden by the smoke from the altar of incense, and that smoke protected him from looking at the Shekinah presence of God. So while the earthly high priest entered into the Holy of Holies somewhat secretively and hidden by smoke, this one entered boldly into the heavenly Holy of Holies to appear openly before God. Messiah did not enter the holy place made with hands. The one he entered into was not the man-made one, which in turn was merely a copy of the true one, the one in heaven. So he entered into heaven itself, where the original tabernacle is located. And now Jesus appears before God, in the presence of God, on the behalf of believers, on behalf of you and I. And in verse 25, nor yet, in 25 26, which is the second key truth, in verse 25, nor yet that he should offer himself often, as the high priest entered into the holy place year by year with blood not his own. Else must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world. But now, once at the end of the ages, had he been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. So, the second key truth in these verses is that he entered with a finished atonement. It's finished. Again, we see a contrast being made here, and the contrast being made is between the once and for all offering and the year by year offering. Jesus did not go up there so that he could offer, or that he should offer himself many times. He should offer himself. It says that he should not offer himself often. The high priest on earth had to offer yearly. Every year he had to enter the Holy of Holies, carrying in blood not his own. That is, he carries in the blood of another, which is the blood of an animal. And that was the problem. That was the problem. He went in by blood, but it was by animal blood. It was not even by sinful human blood. For if it was his own blood, the high priest would have had to suffer many times since the foundation of the world. Because sinful human blood would not have been sufficient for a once and for all sacrifice. So if the one offering was sufficient, it would not have been needed to be repeated. The fact that it was repeated shows that it was not eternally sufficient. But Jesus accomplished eternal efficacy for us. His is efficient, it's sufficient. If the high priest had to offer his own blood, then repeated offerings would require repeated sufferings. But the essence of physical death is, as a general rule, only once. But now, second part of verse 26, but now, once at the end of the ages, had he been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. So the third key truth is found in the second part of verse 26. Having entered into heaven with a finished atonement, Jesus has now put away sin forever. So the third key truth is Jesus has put away sin forever. But now once, it says, in contrast to the many earthly ones, and the timing, when did this happen? It was at the end of the ages. And this expression means that it was a termination of a series of preparatory ages or dispensations, very similar to what Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, Galatians 4, verse 4, where he says, but when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. So when God's timetable reached the proper moment, Jesus was sent. He appeared at the incarnation. That's when he was sent. And the key purpose was to put away sin. This time he would not merely achieve forgiveness, which the Old Testament saints achieved. This time he would achieve a total disannulling. And the Greek word used here is the same word we saw back in chapter 7, verse 18, where the author back there declared the disannulling of the Mosaic law. And these are the only two times this word is used in the New Testament. Just as the law was disannulled or put away, so Jesus came to disannul or to put away sin once and for all. Unlike the work of the earthly priest, this one did a perfect work because it put away sin to the point that sin has been put away forever. Unlike the earthly priest, sorry, I'm doubling up there. So what we see here, that it was a personal sacrifice. It was the sacrifice of himself. He put away sin not by blood that was not his own, but by his own blood. In place of achieving temporary atonement, this one achieved a permanent atonement. In verses 27 to 28, the believers anticipate the expected return of the priest to announce his finished work. Now, remember, we're looking at the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and what the high priest did in that day. When the earthly high priest entered into the Holy of Holies to provide atonement and to sprinkle the blood on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, he eventually came out of the Holy of Holies. And when he came out of the Holy of Holies after sprinkling the blood of the goat, that was a witness that he had finished his work inside. It was all done. Now, at his ascension, Jesus went into heaven. He's presently still in heaven, but one day he will return in like manner. And he'll come out of the heavenly tabernacle, and his return will witness a finished atonement. It's finished. The job's done. In verse 27, we've done it. In verse 27, the author points out the principle that judgment follows death. And inasmuch as it is appointed unto men once to die, and after this comes judgment. Now, even under the Mosaic system, there could be no more offerings for sin after death. It is natural then that judgment follows death. You die, you then face judgment. Judgment following death is the manifestation of what the one who died was. If you're a non-believer, judgment will follow you after death. The judgment is now determined by what the person was while he was living. This phrase we see here that says, it is appointed unto men once to die, that's a general principle. It's not an absolute rule, because there are two types of exceptions to this, and one you'd know straight away. The first exception is that some people died twice. Remember, people who were resurrected before Jesus was resurrected and died again later, like Lazarus. Lazarus died twice. A second exception to this principle is that some do not die at all. So far in history, two people, Enoch and Elijah, never died. Now, some people misunderstand verse 27 to be an absolute rule, and therefore they teach that Enoch and Elijah must return someday to die, and they then teach that, hey, these guys must be the two witnesses of Revelation 11. Because they haven't died, they need to come back and die. But there's nothing in Revelation 11 to say that it is Enoch and Elijah, that they're the two witnesses. If this is an absolute rule, what about us when we get raptured? Paul stated that we shall all not die. We shall not all die. Some will be living when the rapture occurs and therefore will be caught up alive. If this is an absolute rule that Enoch and Elijah must return to die, then it means that the living believers who are raptured will also have to return to die. This is simply, it's a general principle. It's not an absolute rule. And there are these two exceptions. Some will die twice, others will not die at all. Now, the judgment following death was the manifestation of what the person who died was. But in verse 28, in the case of Jesus, his coming is the manifestation of what the one who died was. He will show his perfection. So Christ also, having been once offered to bear the sins of many, shall appear a second time. Another time, he is going to come out of that heavenly tabernacle someday. We don't know when. And the next time he comes, he will come apart from sin. What does that mean? It means that his return will not concern the sin question. Apart from sin, to them that wait for him unto salvation. So his first coming was for the purpose of dealing with the issue of sin, and he dealt with it on the cross. His second coming will not be to deal with the sin issue. He is coming for them that wait for him unto salvation. All the redeemed wait for his return, for him to complete his redemption. The completion of the redemption process includes the redemption of the body, which will occur with the resurrection of the body. So when he returns, it is unto salvation, signifying in this case the full salvation, including the future facet of salvation, which is the redemption of the body. So his point here is that since judgment follows death, either the one who died is judged, or if not, then there must be a substitute. And for the believer, Jesus is that substitute. So this section we can summarize in 4 points. First of all, the author emphasized the completeness of the one single act of Jesus. It was a once for all sacrifice, which was perfect, and there is no need for repetition. Second, this is in contrast to the repeated work of the high priest on the Day of Atonement. His work was never finished because he had to repeat it again the next year and the next year and the next year. Third, Jesus is now present in heaven, and his presence in heaven means 3 things. First up, the heavenly tabernacle or sanctuary has been cleansed. Second, his presence means that sin for the believer has been put away forever. And third, his presence in heaven ensures God's favorable verdict. And when Jesus reappears, God's favorable verdict will be confirmed by the final aspect of salvation, the redemption or glorification of the body. Now, the fourth thing we see is that he has dealt with, the author here has dealt with 3 appearances of Jesus. We see his appearance or coming at the end of the ages. Or actually, I think that's the next page. Yeah. His appearance or coming at the end of the ages, meaning his appearance at the first coming as their sin bearer. Second, he appeared in the heavenly tabernacle in the presence of God with a finished atonement. And third, his appearance in the future for the second time when he comes again to fulfill their salvation. At this time, the believer will receive the inheritance of chapter 9, verse 15, which is the Messianic kingdom. And that is it for this day. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.